In the early 4th century AD, in Roman Hispania, the marble streets of Merida echoed with the sound of sandals. Among the citizens walked a small girl, only 13 years old, named Eulalia. She had no idea that within hours she would face one of the most horrifying executions in the Roman Empire's history. According to ancient tradition, Eulalia endured 13 tortures, one for each year of her life. Whether the number was symbolic or real, it expressed the savage cruelty of her death. But why would a child defy the might of Rome so openly? And why would the authorities stage such a gruesome public execution just for her? To answer, we must step into her world. By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was collapsing into chaos. Emperors rose and fell in months. Barbarian attacks shattered the frontiers. The economy was crumbling, and in the shadows, a new religion, Christianity, was spreading. Emperor Diocletian, who rose to power in 284 AD, believed Rome's misfortunes came from the anger of its gods. To him, Christians had abandoned the ancient faith, and the gods demanded punishment. In 303 AD, Diocletian launched the Great Persecution, the most violent crackdown Christians had faced. Across the empire, churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and believers arrested. In Merida, a wealthy Christian merchant family raised Eulalia quietly, teaching her the faith in secret. Her parents feared the Roman authorities, but admired their daughter's devotion. While other children played with toys, Eulalia memorized Christian scripture and prayed for hours. When the persecution reached Merida in 304 AD, Governor Dacian received strict orders. Every citizen must worship Rome's gods or face death. Pagan temples reopened with grand ceremonies. Sacrifices were mandatory. Anyone who refused would be marked as a Christian and punished. Eulalia's parents acted quickly. They hid her at a rural estate outside the city, hoping to protect her. But their daughter saw things differently. To Eulalia, hiding was cowardice. This was her chance to stand for her faith. One cold December morning, she slipped away. For hours, she walked along dusty roads toward Merida, not to return home, but to confront the Roman governor himself. At the palace gates, guards were puzzled by the sight of a well-dressed child demanding to see Dacian. Curious, the governor allowed her in. She entered with the confidence of an adult, her dark braids swinging as her sharp eyes fixed on him. "Why have you come here, child?" he asked. Her answer silenced the hall. "I am a Christian, and I denounce the lies of your false gods." The governor's face hardened. He tried reason first. "Go back to your parents, make sacrifice to the gods, and be forgiven." But Eulalia stepped to the temple altar in the hall, spat on the idols, trampled their offerings, and declared, "Your gods are demons. Only Christ is true." Gasps filled the air. Guards rushed forward, but Dacian stopped them. This was more than defiance. It was a public insult. She would be punished, not quietly, but in a way that would terrify others. Eulalia was taken to prison. The next morning, the people of Merida gathered in the main square. The crowd buzzed with rumors of a Christian girl who had challenged the governor to his face. When Eulalia appeared, small and fragile in a plain tunic, the crowd was stunned, but her eyes still burned with the same fearless light. She walked as if heading to a celebration, not to her death. Dacian's voice rang out. "This girl defied Rome's gods. She will pay the price of blasphemy." The square in Merida had been transformed into a stage of fear. Roman soldiers surrounded the platform, and the tools of execution were laid out in full view: whips, iron hooks, burning torches, chains, and pots of boiling oil. The crowd watched in silence, many out of curiosity, others out of morbid desire, and some with heavy hearts. Knowing they were about to witness the suffering of a child, Dacian had decided that Eulalia's punishment would not be swift. Each step would be slow, deliberate, and public, a warning to any who dared follow her example. According to ancient accounts, poet Prudentius recorded the events with both horror and reverence. Whether every detail is literal or symbolic, the cruelty of the persecution was very real. The first torture was the whipping. 2 soldiers took positions on either side of Eulalia, their rods striking her small body again and again. Her skin split under each blow, crimson lines spreading across her back and arms. But she did not cry. Instead, her lips moved in prayer, whispering verses she had memorized since childhood. The second torture was far worse. Iron hooks were used to tear at her flesh, pulling skin and muscle away in ragged strips. The onlookers gasped, but Eulalia's voice rose above the noise. She was singing a hymn, her voice shaking yet unbroken. Next came the burning torches. The soldiers pressed them to her open wounds, the heat searing into raw flesh. The smell of burning skin filled the air, making some in the crowd turn away. Still, she endured without begging for mercy. The fourth torture added humiliation to pain. Coarse salt was rubbed into her wounds, each grain stabbing like hundreds of tiny needles. Her body trembled, but her gaze remained fixed upward, as though she could already see the heavens. The fifth torture brought red-hot irons to her ribs. The hiss of flesh against metal made the crowd recoil. Some Roman citizens began to murmur, uneasy with the brutality being inflicted on one so young. Then came the sixth, her fingernails torn out one by one. Blood streamed from her small hands, but she kept them clenched in defiance. By now, the whispers in the crowd were growing louder. The seventh torture poured boiling oil over her back and shoulders. The liquid hissed as it struck her wounds, sending waves of unbearable pain through her frail frame. She swayed on her feet, but refused to fall. Through each agony, Dacian watched closely, expecting the child to break. Yet with each attack, her spirit seemed to grow stronger. She spoke no words of surrender, made no pleas for life. Her defiance was now as much a threat to Roman authority as any armed rebellion. By the time the eighth torture began, mutilating the soles of her feet with sharp blades, even some soldiers looked disturbed. Eulalia could barely stand, but she used the last of her strength to keep her head held high. The ninth torture was the most shocking yet. Molten lead poured over her head. The liquid metal burned through hair and skin alike, a blinding white agony. Many in the square turned away entirely, unable to watch. The 10th saw her hair ripped out in handfuls, pieces of scalp torn with it. Her breathing was ragged now, her songs fainter, but she still whispered prayers. The 11th torture tore at her breasts with iron hooks. The 12th covered her in burning coals, her skin blistering instantly. By now, the air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke. Eulalia's voice had grown almost too weak to hear, but it was still there, defiant, unbroken. She had endured 12 tortures. Only one remained, the one that would end her life. Dacian gave the final order. In the center of the square, a pyre had been prepared. The guards lifted Eulalia's frail body and carried her to the center of the square. She could no longer walk. Her feet were torn, her skin burned, her wounds deep. They tied her to the wooden stake, binding her hands so tightly the rope bit into her flesh. The crowd stood in heavy silence, waiting for the final act of this public ordeal. As the soldiers lit the pyre, smoke curled upward, and flames began to lick her feet. The heat rose quickly, wrapping her in waves of burning air. Many expected her to scream, to finally cry out in agony. But instead, she lifted her head and, with what little breath she had left, whispered a final prayer. Then, according to the ancient hymns of Prudentius, something extraordinary happened. At the moment her life ended, a white dove was said to emerge from her mouth and rise into the sky. For Christians, it was a sign of her soul being taken to heaven. Even some Romans who had come to watch were shaken, seeing it as a symbol they could not explain. Dacian's plan had been to crush the Christian spirit through fear. But as the fire consumed Eulalia's small body, the opposite began to happen. Whispers spread through the crowd of her courage, of the dove, of her unbroken faith. Instead of discouraging believers, her death inspired them. Fearing her story would spark defiance, Dacian ordered that her name never be spoken in public. Her body was left tied to the stake overnight, intended to be devoured by wild animals. But under the cover of darkness, a small group of Christians braved the Roman guards and carried her remains away. They buried her in secret, just outside the city. Her grave soon became a place of pilgrimage. Christians from across Hispania came to pray and to honor the young martyr. Stories of miracles began to circulate. The sick claimed to be healed after visiting her tomb. The hopeless claimed to find courage there. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, less than a decade after her death, Eulalia was officially recognized as a saint. Over her burial site, a great basilica was built, its walls decorated with paintings of her final moments. Pilgrims flocked to the site, keeping her memory alive. Prudentius' 4th century poetry immortalized her story, ensuring that her name would never be forgotten. His verses described her as a warrior of faith, though her weapons were only words and unshakable belief. For over 17 centuries, the image of a small girl standing fearless before the might of Rome has remained one of Christianity's most powerful symbols. Today, Eulalia is the patron saint of Merida, and every year, on December 10th, the date of her death, the city honors her with ceremonies and prayers. The basilica still stands, welcoming thousands of visitors who come to remember the child who defied an empire. Her story leaves us with a haunting question. How could someone so young possess such unbreakable strength? Her martyrdom shows the extremes of human nature, the depths of cruelty and the heights of courage. Eulalia's life was short, but her conviction made it eternal. She did not surrender, even when faced with fire, iron, and death itself. In choosing to die rather than betray her faith, she turned her execution into a victory, not for Rome, but for the belief she carried in her heart. And so, the girl who walked through Merida streets on that cold December morning became a legend, her voice echoing across centuries. Faith is stronger than fear.